Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to show you how to make a simple rock paper scissors game using Python. Now the first thing you should do is create a Python file. I name my own rps.py, which stands for rock paper scissors. So we're going to be using two libraries for this project. The first one I'm going to use is random. So we'll just go ahead and say import random. Now random is an inbuilt library, so you don't have to worry about installing it. But the next library that we're going to use, which is Colorama, isn't inbuilt, so we're going to have to install it. Go to your command line, cd into your desktop environment, and run this command, pip install Colorama. That is going to install the Colorama module for you. Once you've installed it, just type exactly what I'm typing. We'll say from Colorama import init. And we'll come down and say init. Then we'll say from Colorama import 4. Now we have the modules that we're going to use ready. Let's now explain the logic of how everything is going to work. Now in this rock paper scissors game, there are going to be 3 levels, and for each level a variable is going to keep track of the score of each player. That is, when the rock paper scissors game is played, if the player wins, the score of the player automatically becomes 1. But if the CPU wins, that is, if your computer wins, the CPU score becomes 1. And then it's going to keep building up or eventually until one of the players gets to 3 points. And when one of the players gets to 3 points, that player wins. Now, how is this actually going to happen? First, we need to create 2 variables, the player score and the CPU score. We would say player score is equal to 0 and CPU score is equal to 0, because this is the start of the game and their scores are going to be 0. Now the next thing to do is that we need to put it inside a while loop, and just type what I'm going to type now. I'm going to explain how it works. We would say while player score is less than 3 and CPU score is less than 3, then execute this block of code that we're going to write. So what we're saying is that, okay, while the player score and CPU score is less than 3, execute the code that is inside here. That is, the maximum amount of points that a player can get to is 3 points. And when a player gets to 3 points, this program is going to break out of this while loop, and it's going to print whoever has gotten 3 points has won. That is, if player score is now equal to 3, it's going to break out of this while loop and it's going to say player has won. So now that we've created this while loop, we now need to write our logic inside. But before we proceed, we need to create a list. Now we know that for the player, we already know that we can either input rock, paper, or scissors. But how exactly is our computer going to be able to pick between rock, paper, and scissors? We have to write some lines of code that is going to help it. And for that, we're going to be using this random library. So the first thing we'll do is that we need to create a list. And inside that list, there's going to be rock, paper, and scissors. Now, it is from this list that this our computer is going to pick from. It's going to pick as random. So we're going to say, define a list. We'll say possible CPU pick is equal to, we'll now create a list, and the first item is going to be rock, second item is going to be paper, and third item is going to be scissors. Now we've created this list. We now need to come down and create CPU pick. Now we're going to create a variable. This variable is what is going to generate, is going to randomly pick the variable is the variable that's going to randomly pick from this list. So I'm going to say CPU pick is equal to random dot choice and then inside this bracket we would say possible CPU peak. So what this line of code does is that it goes into this list and automatically picks one item from this list at random. So after doing that, we now need to ask the player for his own input, since this line of code here has already picked the CPU's choice. So now we're going to now write an input statement. We're going to say player pick is equal to input. Then we're going to tell the person to input rock, paper or scissors. Rock, paper or scissors. So now we've created two variables, CPU pick and player pick. We've explained what this first one does, and this second variable, we've explained what it does. This is what we players, this is the variable that's going to take in our input. Now, after doing that, we're not going to, because this is going to be running in a terminal. After doing this, we're not going to print out what the player picked and what the CPU picked, so that we'll be able to know that, okay, so that we're going to be able to tell who actually won by ourselves, but the program is also going to be able to tell who won. So I'm going to say print, then I'm going to just use this F because we want to print it out in this particular format. I'm not going to say CPU pick is equal to, then inside the curly brackets we're going to say CPU pick. Then after doing this, we'll just give space and maybe do something like this. And then after doing that, or we're just going to say CPU pick versus then player pick. I'll give that and do this, and inside the curly brackets we'll just say player pick. So what this line of code does is that after the your computer has picked its own choice and you have picked your own choice, it's now going to print out what you picked and what the computer picked. So let's just give space here. I would say print. Yes. So now here it's going to print out what you picked and what the computer picked. Now we now need to write the main code for everything. That is, we need to write, okay, if this is that, then execute this. We're going to be using a lot of if statements now. So now we're going to write an if statement. We want to check if what the player picked is equal to what the CPU picked. We want it to print it's a tie. So we're going to do this by saying if player pick is equal to CPU pick, then want it to print it's a tie. It is a tie. So if what the player picks and what the CPU picks, that is, if what the player picks and what the computer picks are equal, the same thing, it's going to print it's a tie. So let's now give it space. We also want it to print something else. After printing it's a tie, we want it to print the present scores. That is, these two things. We want it to print the present scores of each player, that is the CPU score and the player score. So I'm not going to say print. We want to print something out in this particular format. So we'll use the F and then we'll put in quotes. Then we're going to say CPU score. And we'll put in colon, and then we'll now come here and write this variable into this place in curly brackets. Then we'll say CPU score. And then we'll now say versus player score. Player score. And then we'll put in colon, then inside the curly brackets we would say player score. So what this is going to do is that it's just going to, let's just give this space. Yes. So what this line of code is going to do is that it's going to now, after it has printed this tie, it's now going to print out what the current score of the player is and what the current score of the CPU is. So now we've written the logic for if what the player picked is equal to what the CPU picked. We now need to move on to the next thing. What if what the player picks is equal to rock? Let's now write a conditional for that. We'll say else if player pick is equal to rock. Now this is where things get a little confusing, because now we're going to be having nested conditionals. So here we're saying that if the player pick, that is if what we input is equal to rock, then we're now going to write another conditional inside here. We're going to say if CPU pick is equal to let's say paper, PAPER, then we would put colon here and press enter. That is, now we've already picked our own. What if what we input is rock and what the CPU picks is paper? From here we can already see that okay, obviously the CPU is going to win because paper covers rock. Then now we're not going to write the logic that adds a score to the CPU score because the CPU here wins. So what we're going to say is that we're going to say CPU plus equal to 1. So we're going to say CPU score, yes, CPU score SCORE plus equal to 1. So what this means is that it's the same thing as saying CPU score is equal to CPU score plus 1. So I'm just going to do it like this to make it easier. CPU score plus 1. So now we've seen that okay, if we pick rock and our computer picks paper, it's now going to come here over here to the top and add 1 point to CPU score. Then we now want it to print something else. We want it to print CPU has 1 point or computer has 1 point. We want it to print okay, CPU has 1 point. Then after doing this, we also want it to print something else. We'll give it space there. We also want it to print something else. We want it to print the present scores of each player. So we're going to say print, we'll use the F again, and then we still want it to print the CPU score and the player score. So we'll just copy this, Ctrl C and Ctrl V. So what this is going to do is that once we've already picked rock and CPU picks paper, obviously we know that okay, the CPU has 1. So 1 point is going to be added to CPU score over here. Once 1 point is added to CPU score, it's now going to come down and print the total scores. So when it prints the total scores, we're going to see that CPU score is equal to 1 and versus player score is equal to 0. So after doing that, we've written the logic for okay, if player picks rock and CPU picks paper. So what if CPU picks this thing, scissors? We're going to say L if CPU pick is equal to scissors. Then we're just going to put colon in front. Now I'm going to explain something here. We're only going to do if CPU pick is equal to paper and if CPU pick is equal to scissors. We're not going to do else if CPU pick is equal to rock, because if you come to the top here, we've already done if player pick is equal to CPU pick. That is, if they pick the same thing, execute this code. So over here, we don't need to put else if CPU pick is equal to rock, because we've already done it here, and it's going to execute this code anytime what we pick and what the CPU picks is equal to the same. Now we're going to say else if CPU pick is equal to scissors. Now it's going to execute the following command below. Now we know that if we know that rock between rock and scissors, rock wins. So if the player picks rock and the CPU picks scissors, we're now going to say player score, PLAYER, player score plus equal to 1. That is, we are saying player score is equal to player score plus 1. So what that is going to do now is that if we pick rock and the CPU picks scissors, we know that we already have 1 point. So it's going to add 1 point to our score over here. I hope you are getting what I'm saying. So now it's going to add 1 point to our score there. Then it's now going to print, we want it to print player has 1 point. So we'll just put it there and say player has 1 point. And we'll just put an exclamation mark. Let's put an exclamation mark here too. So we'll say player has 1 point and we'll give it space. Yes. So after doing that, we now also want it to print this thing. We want it to print the present score for the player and the CPU. So we'll just copy this, Ctrl C, and we'll come to this line and paste it. So what this line does is that if what you pick is rock, if what the player picks is rock and what CPU picks is scissors, it's going to know that okay, the player has 1 point because rock breaks scissors. So it's going to add 1 point to the player score. Then it's going to print player has 1 point. Then it's going to print the score. When it prints the score, it's going to be CPU score is 0 versus player score, which is 1. Now we've written a logic for if the player picks rock. Now what if the player picks scissors? We're just going to come here, copy everything that we've written here. We'll do Ctrl C. Then we'll come here and do Ctrl V. So now we are going to change this. Oh, this code is getting large. So we are going to change this now. This is the first logic. So we now want to say, okay, what if player pick is equal to scissors or paper? Sorry, rock, paper, yeah. So what if player pick is equal to paper? Now we're just going to be changing some things. And if CPU pick is equal to rock, here we know that okay, player has picked paper and CPU has picked rock. So we know that okay, paper covers rock, and here we know that okay, since player paper covers rock, here we know that the player is going to have 1 point. So we're going to say we're going to change this to player score. We'll say player score is equal to player score plus 1. So now that is going to add 1 point to the player score. We'll now come in here and change this to player has 1 point. Now we've done this. It's now going to come here and print this player score and CPU score. Now we now need to come down also to check now okay, what if the CPU score is equal to scissors? We know that okay, scissors cuts paper, so therefore it's going to be CPU plus equal to 1. That is, since scissors cuts paper and we picked paper and your computer picked scissors, we are going to know that okay, our computer has 1 point. So it's going to add 1 point to the CPU score at the top over here. So now that it has done that, it's now going to come down here and say okay, we'll change this to CPU has 1 point. We'll come here and say CPU has 1 point. Okay, I'll just okay, so we've done for rock and we've done for paper. Now it's time for us to do for scissors, that is player pick. So I'm just going to come here and for there to be space, I'll just say print that. Oh, it's in capital letter, sorry. I will just say print for us to have space. Then I'll come here also and do that. So we now want to come down here and say, okay, what if player pick, which is here, equal to scissors? Now we'll write a logic for that. Else, if player pick equal to scissors, then we'll put colon there. Now if player pick is equal to scissors, we're just going to Ctrl V and paste everything again. So now, oh, we need to indent everything properly. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so now we've said, okay, if player pick is equal to scissors. Now we now have here that if CPU picks paper, obviously we know that scissors cuts paper. So this is going to be player score is equal to player score plus 1, because we know that, okay, we will pick scissors and the CPU picks paper, so scissors cuts paper, therefore we know that we have 1 point, so it's going to add 1 point to our score up above there, and we're going to change this from CPU to player. So it's now going to print player has 1 point, then it's going to come down to this line and print this out, the scores. So we now need to come down here and say, okay, if player has picked scissors and CPU has picked, we need to change this to rock, has picked rock. It's now going to print that, okay, we now know that, okay, player picked scissors, we picked scissors, and the CPU picked rock. We know that rock breaks scissors, therefore we know that it's going to be CPU score plus 1. Since CPU picks rock and we pick scissors, and rock breaks scissors, so I'm going to say CPU score is plus equal to 1, which is also CPU score is equal to CPU score plus 1. And we would come here and change this to CPU has 1 point. We'll say CPU has 1 point, and it's going to come down here and print out CPU score and player score. So we'll just give it space. Now let's just go over everything again. Here we have that. Okay, if player pick is equal to rock and CPU pick is equal to paper, then we know that paper covers rock, so CPU is going to have 1 point. I will say CPU has 1 point, and it's going to print out the score here. Then if we now come down and if CPU picks scissors and we've already picked rock, since rock breaks scissors, player is going to have 1 point. So it's going to come down here and have 1 point, and it's printed out here. So that is how everything here works. That is how it works. So we now need to come down. We've already written a logic for if player inputs rock, paper, or scissors. And then we know that if either of the scores is equal to 3, it's going to break out of this while loop. So when it breaks out of this while loop, we want the program to actually say something. We want the program to do something. Now that is what we're going to do right here. But before we break out of it, we need to say that if the user, which is us, if we don't input rock, paper, or scissors, we're going to tell the program to print out error, invalid input. So we'll say else. Then to now come down, print, we'll say print invalid input. Invalid inputs. So it's going to print out invalid input. Now we've already done for rock, paper, and scissors. When it now breaks out of this while loop, we want the program to do something. Now we're going to now write the code. So when it breaks out of the while loop, we want the program to check if player has 3 points or if CPU has 3 points. Now it's going to check whichever has 3 points, and it's going to print out the winner as the person that has 3 points. But there's a simpler way to do this. What we're simply going to say is we're going to use if player is greater than phone. That is, if at the point where it has broken out of this while loop, if at that point, if the player is, if the player score is greater than the CPU score, then it should print out player wins. But if CPU score is greater than player score, it should print out CPU wins. So we're going to do that by saying this. We're going to say if player score is greater than CPU score, we're just going to put colon here. We're now going to say print player wins. Oh, mistake. Print player wins. Then to now come down and say else, we will now say else print CPU wins. Now I'm going to explain this. Now here I'm going to go over it again. When it breaks out of the while loop, we know that okay, either CPU or player has 3 points. Now what this line does is that it now goes to check that if the player score is greater than CPU score, that is, we know that since that's broken out of the loop, player score is definitely going to be 3 points. So we're now going to say that if player score is greater than CPU score, print player wins. Else, print CPU wins. That is, else, the only other option that's going to be available is that CPU score is greater than player score. So we're going to say else, print CPU wins. Now this is a point where we're now going to use this colorama module that we imported. Now I'm going to explain how we use it. We use it to make colored text in the terminal for it to make our output look at least beautiful to some extent. So what we are going to say here is that I'm just going to come here and say for dot blue, BLUE, and then after that we will say plus. So what this line of code does is that in the terminal, if CPU wins, it's going to print out CPU wins, but CPU wins is going to be in the color blue. Now we are going to see the results in the terminal. So I'm just going to add this to all the printouts and all the inputs. So here I'm going to say if the player wins, it's going to be 4. Going to be 4 dots yellow, YELLOW, and we'll say plus. So I will keep doing this. Let me just go ahead and start from the beginning. I have added all the coloring I want. This is it here, 4 dots green. If you scroll down, you would see that I have added some colors there. So that is how you use the colorama module. You just say 4 dots, then in capital letter the name of the color you want this particular text to be in the terminal, then plus space the text. Now when we've already written all this code, but let us actually check if this code runs perfectly. So I'm just going to make my terminal bigger here, then I'm going to run this code, and we're just going to see how well it runs. My laptop is so slow. Okay, so it's asking us input rock, paper or scissors. If I say paper and I press enter, oh, look at that, it says CPU picked rock and I picked paper. Therefore, since paper covers rock, it now prints out player has 1 point. Then if you see here, CPU score is 0, player score is 1. If I say rock and I press enter, It's going to say player has 1 point. I have 1 point again because I picked rock and my computer picked scissors. So therefore I have 2 points. If I say paper again and I press enter, it says CPU has 1 point because CPU picked scissors and I picked paper. So I'm just going to play with this, and if I say scissors and I press enter, it's going to say, oh, CPU has 1 point. Oh, this is the finishing round now. Let me say rock. I hope I win. If I say rock, oh, it's a tie. I'll say rock again. It's a tie again. Okay, I would say rock again. No, I lost. And as you can see, CPU has 3 points and I had 2 points, so it's printed